June 20th, 2001, began like any other humid morning in Clear Lake, Texas. But if you could pull back the roof of the modest brick house on Beachcomber Lane, you wouldn't see a typical suburban morning. You would see a woman standing on a precipice. Most people know Andrea Yates as the name in the headlines, the mother who committed the unthinkable. But to understand why the water was running in that bathtub, we have to travel back a decade, away from the sirens and the crime scene tape, to a time when Andrea was a woman of science, a woman of healing, and a woman who was slowly being led into a wilderness of the mind. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about how isolation and radicalism can turn a sanctuary into a tomb. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Before she was the most hated woman in America, Andrea Kennedy was a person of immense promise. Born in Halle, Texas, she was the youngest of 5 children. In high school, she wasn't a loner or an outcast. She was the valedictorian, an officer in the National Honor Society, and a captain of the swim team. This detail, her history as a competitive swimmer, is a haunting irony that would later be used by prosecutors to paint her as efficient in water. She followed her drive for service into the medical field, graduating from the University of Texas School of Nursing. By all accounts, she was an elite nurse. She worked at the prestigious MD Anderson Cancer Center, where she dealt with life, death, and the highest levels of professional stress with poise. In 1989, she met Russell "Rusty" Yates, a NASA engineer. They were 2 high achievers, grounded in their careers and their shared Christian faith. They married in 1993, telling friends they wanted to have as many children as nature allowed. The shift began subtly. Rusty had become fascinated with an itinerant preacher named Michael Warnicki. Warnicki wasn't a typical pastor. He was a street preacher who traveled the country in a bus with his family, shouting through bullhorns about the falsehood of modern Christianity. His doctrine was one of extreme withdrawal. He taught that modern society was a satanic trap, and that the only way to be saved was through total isolation from the world's influences. While Rusty found the message challenging and invigorating, for Andrea, it was the beginning of a cage. The couple sold their home and almost all their possessions to move into a 350-square-foot converted Greyhound bus. This was the bus life for a woman who had spent her career in the sterile, organized environment of a world-class hospital. Being confined to a cramped, metal tube with a growing number of toddlers was a recipe for psychological claustrophobia. Warnicki's influence didn't stop at their housing. He and his wife, Rachel, sent letters and cassette tapes to the Yates family. These weren't messages of hope. They were messages of doom. Rachel Warnicki's letters were particularly targeted at Andrea, telling her that if she did not raise her children in a godly way, their blood would be on her hands. She was told that her children were stumbling toward hell because of her failures as a mother. To a woman already predisposed to depression, this wasn't just religion. It was a spiritual death sentence. In 1999, the cracks became chasms. After the birth of her 4th son, Luke, the weight of the bus life, the homeschooling, and the constant spiritual berating became too much. Andrea attempted to take her own life by swallowing a bottle of trazodone. She was hospitalized and diagnosed with a major depressive disorder. The medical records from this first stay are chillingly prophetic. She was in a catatonic state, meaning she would sit for hours, unmoving, staring into a void. It was here that she was first prescribed Haldol, a potent antipsychotic. It worked. For a time, the fog cleared, but the underlying environment didn't change. She went back to the bus. She went back to the isolation. Her primary psychiatrist at the time, Dr. Eileen Starbranch, was blunt with the couple. She saw the trajectory. She told Rusty and Andrea that Andrea had postpartum psychosis, a rare and dangerous condition where a mother loses touch with reality. She warned them in no uncertain terms, do not have more children. She explained that a 5th pregnancy would act like a trigger, likely resulting in a complete and total psychotic break from which Andrea might not return. In a world of science, Dr. Starbranch's warning was a life raft. But in the world of the Warnicki doctrine, it was a test of faith. The couple believed that birth control was sinful and that God would provide the strength to handle whatever came. Against all medical advice, Andrea became pregnant with her fifth child, Mary, in early 2000. As the pregnancy progressed, Andrea's father, with whom she was very close, passed away. This grief was the final weight. Andrea stopped speaking again. She began to obsessively read the Bible, looking for signs of her own wickedness. She began to believe that the only way to protect her children from the satanic world the preacher warned about was through a radical, desperate act. By the time Mary was born in November 2000, Andrea was no longer the valedictorian or the oncology nurse. She was a woman who believed she carried the mark of the beast. She had begun to experience hallucinations. She thought she saw images on the television of people being executed. She thought the cartoon characters her children watched were mocking her. Rusty moved the family out of the bus and into a standard house in Clear Lake, hoping the space would help. But the house didn't help. It only gave her more rooms to hide in. It gave her a bathtub. In the spring of 2001, Andrea was hospitalized twice more. She was suicidal. She was found filling the bathtub at random times during the day. When asked why, she couldn't give a clear answer. She was discharged from her final hospital stay on June 14, 2001, just 6 days before the tragedy. Her new doctor, believing her condition was improving, made the fateful decision to taper her off of Haldol. She was sent home to a house full of 5 children under the age of 7. She was unmedicated, grieving, and still consuming the fire and brimstone tapes of Michael Warrenecki. The fuse was lit. As the sun rose on June 20th, Andrea waited for the sound of Rusty's car to pull out of the driveway. She had a 1-hour window before her mother-in-law arrived to help. In that hour, the teachings of a cult, the failure of a medical system, and the silence of a suburban home would converge. Andrea Yates wasn't just preparing for a morning of homeschooling. She was preparing to save her children's souls by destroying their lives. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. By the middle of June 2001, the Yates household on Beachcomber Lane had become a pressure cooker of unaddressed pathology. To the outside world, Rusty and Andrea were managing a large family with the efficiency of a NASA engineer and a former nurse. But the domestic routine was a thin veil over a deepening chasm. Andrea had transitioned from a state of deep depression into a full-scale, florid psychosis. In clinical terms, she was no longer living in the same world as her husband or her children. She was living in a world of spiritual warfare, where the mundane layout of her home had been transformed into a battlefield for the souls of her offspring. The medical landscape leading up to this point was a series of missed exits. Following her discharge on June 14th, just 6 days before the event, Andrea was in a state of fragile remission, or so her doctors thought. However, the decision to taper her off Haldol, the very drug that had previously pulled her back from the brink of catatonia, remains one of the most scrutinized medical decisions in Texas history. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Muhammad said, had seen a woman who was compliant and quiet. In the world of overburdened mental health systems, a quiet patient is often mistaken for a recovering one. But Andrea's silence wasn't peace. It was the silence of a mind that had already concluded that the world was beyond saving. On the morning of June 20th, the routine was rigid. Rusty would leave for his job at the Johnson Space Center, and his mother, Dora Yates, would arrive shortly after to help Andrea manage the 5 children. Doctors had explicitly warned Rusty that Andrea should not be left alone for even a moment. They recognized that her suicidal ideation could easily morph into homicidal ideation, a common and terrifying pivot in postpartum psychosis cases. Rusty, however, felt that Andrea needed to regain her independence. He believed that by giving her small windows of autonomy, he was helping her step back into her life. He decided that a 1-hour gap between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. would be her test. At 9 a.m., Rusty's car pulled out of the driveway. The house was filled with the sounds of breakfast and the energy of 5 children. 7-year-old Noah, 5-year-old John, 3-year-old Paul, 2-year-old Luke, and 6-month-old Mary. For Andrea, the departure of her husband was the signal. In her delusional state, she believed she was being watched by the adversary. She believed that because she had failed as a mother, a belief reinforced by years of Michael Warrenicki's fire and brimstone teachings. Her children were becoming corrupted. In her mind, they were developing satanic traits. The only way to stop their descent into eternal damnation was to return them to God while they were still young and innocent. She began with the boys. The sequence was not random. It was a methodical execution of a rescue mission. She filled the bathtub with cold water. One by one, she called the middle children into the bathroom. Paul, Luke, and John. In the hierarchy of the home, they trusted their mother implicitly. There were no screams that reached the neighbors. There was only the sound of splashing and the heavy, humid air of a Texas morning. As each child's life was extinguished, Andrea's psychosis guided her next steps. She didn't leave them in the water. She carried their small, wet bodies to the back bedroom. She laid them on her bed, side by side, and covered them with a sheet. This was a ritual of tucking them in for the last time. She was, in her own fractured reality, being a good mother. She was putting them to rest where they would be safe from the world. The final two were the most difficult. 6-month-old Mary was in her crib. Andrea brought the infant into the bathroom. As she held her daughter in the water, the oldest son, Noah, walked in. Noah was 7. He was old enough to understand the bus life, old enough to remember his mother being taken away in an ambulance before, and old enough to know that the sight of his sister in the tub was wrong. Noah didn't just stand there. He asked, "What's wrong with Mary?" When Andrea didn't answer, the boy's survival instinct took over. He turned and ran. He fled through the living room, past the homeschooling books and the hand-painted signs of a Christian home. Andrea, the former competitive swimmer, was faster. She caught him in the hallway. The struggle was the only moment of true chaos in that hour of silence. She dragged him back to the bathroom. Once the house was finally, devastatingly quiet, Andrea completed her ritual. She left Noah in the bathtub and placed Mary in the arms of her brother John on the bed. She had previously told investigators that John was a good big brother, and in her mind, he would look after the baby in the afterlife. With the children saved, Andrea sat down at the kitchen table. She didn't clean the water off the floor. She didn't change her wet clothes. She picked up the phone. She didn't call Rusty first. She called 911. The dispatcher who answered heard a woman whose voice was devoid of any recognizable human emotion. "I need a police officer," Andrea said. "What's the problem?" the dispatcher asked. "I just need him to come," Andrea replied. Then she called Rusty at NASA. She didn't tell him what had happened over the phone. She simply said, "It's time. You need to come home." Rusty, sensing the omen in her voice, asked if anyone was hurt. Andrea's response was a chilling refrain. "The kids are hurt." "Which one?" Rusty asked, his heart sinking. "All of them," she replied. When the first responding officer, Sergeant David Lindbergh, arrived at the house, he found the front door unlocked. He entered a home that smelled of dampness and bleach. He saw Andrea. She was shivering, her hair matted to her head, her clothes clinging to her frame. She looked at him with a 1,000-yard stare. There was no hysteria. There were no tears. There was only the flat, mechanical realization of a mission completed. Lindbergh moved toward the back of the house. He found the 4 children on the bed, looking like they were merely napping under the sheet, until he saw the blue tinges on their lips. Then he found Noah in the tub. The officer, a veteran of the force, walked back out to the living room and put his head in his hands. Outside, the Texas sun was climbing higher. Rusty Yates pulled into the driveway, followed shortly by his mother, Dora. They were met by a perimeter of yellow tape and a line of officers who couldn't look them in the eye. As Rusty collapsed on the lawn, the realization began to spread through the neighborhood and eventually the world. The perfect homeschooling mother had just completed the most horrific act imaginable. But as the police took her into custody, the question shifted from what she had done to who had helped her do it. In her pocket, investigators found not just the remnants of her day, but the mental echoes of the preacher who had told her that a mother's failure was the greatest sin of all. As Andrea sat in the back of the patrol car, she wasn't mourning. She was waiting for the world to end, believing she had fulfilled a divine prophecy. But while the public began to scream for her execution, a discovery was about to be made in the prosecution's evidence. A piece of testimony so specific and so damning that it would secure her conviction. The only problem? It was a complete and utter lie. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. By the time the trial of Andrea Yates began in February 2002, the city of Houston was a powder keg of conflicting emotions. Outside the Harris County Criminal Justice Center, protesters carried signs calling for justice for the children, while others held vigils for maternal mental health awareness. Inside the courtroom, the stakes were as high as they could possibly be. The state of Texas was seeking the death penalty. They weren't just asking for life in prison. They were asking for Andrea to be executed by lethal injection. The prosecution, led by Joe Aumby and Kaylin Williford, presented a case built on the calculating nature of the crime. They argued that Andrea's actions were not the result of a mind that had lost touch with reality, but rather a woman who was overwhelmed and chose a permanent, albeit horrific, escape. To prove this, they focused on her behavior immediately following the drownings. She had called 911. She had waited for the police. She had processed the children in a specific order. To the prosecution, this was planning. It was intent. The defense team, George Parnham and Wendell Odom, had a much steeper hill to climb. In Texas, a defendant is presumed sane. To prove insanity, the defense must meet the Emnatin rule, a legal standard dating back to 19th century England. It is not enough to prove that a person is severely mentally ill, or even that they are psychotic. You must prove that at the time of the act, the defendant did not know that their conduct was wrong. The defense called a parade of experts to the stand to testify about the severity of Andrea's condition. They described her catatonia, her previous suicide attempts, and the voices she heard. Dr. Philip Resnick, a world-renowned expert on neonaticide and filicide, explained that Andrea was suffering from the most extreme form of postpartum psychosis he had ever seen. He testified that in her mind, she was not murdering her children. She was sacrificing them to save them from the eternal fires of hell. In her delusional reality, she was acting out of a perverted form of love, influenced by the radical religious teachings she had internalized. However, the prosecution had an answer for every expert. They brought in their own star witness, Dr. Park Dietz. Dietz was the superstar of forensic psychiatry, having testified in the trials of high-profile killers like Jeffrey Dahmer and the Unabomber. Dietz was charismatic, authoritative, and incredibly persuasive to a jury. He argued that Andrea's religious delusions were convenient and that her behavior showed a clear understanding of the law. Then came the moment that would define the 2002 trial. During his testimony, Dr. Dietz told the jury about an episode of the popular television series Law and Order. He claimed that shortly before the drownings, an episode had aired featuring a woman who drowned her children in a bathtub and was acquitted by reason of insanity. The implication was a surgical strike to the defense's case. Andrea wasn't truly psychotic. She was a fan of a crime show. She had watched the episode, saw a way to kill her children and get away with it, and then meticulously followed the script. The impact on the jury was immediate and devastating. It turned Andrea from a victim of a broken mind into a cold-blooded copycat. If she had researched her defense through a television show, she clearly knew that what she was doing was illegal and wrong in the eyes of the law. It bridged the gap between psychosis and calculation in a way that the jury could easily understand. The jury deliberated for only 3.5 hours. In a capital murder case involving 5 children, this was an incredibly short window. They returned with a verdict: guilty. Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, the jury spared her the death penalty, perhaps moved by the sheer tragedy of her life, and sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Andrea was moved to the Skyview Unit, a psychiatric prison in Texas. She was a ghost of a woman, heavily medicated and largely unresponsive to the world around her. To the public, the case was closed. A monster had been put away, and the legal system had functioned as intended. But behind the scenes, the defense team was unsettled. Something about the law and order testimony didn't sit right with them. George Parnham and a group of researchers began a tedious process. This was before the era of easy streaming or comprehensive digital archives. They reached out to the producers of Law and Order. They contacted NBC. They searched through the summaries of every episode of the original series, as well as its spin-offs like Special Victims Unit and Criminal Intent. The results were staggering. They couldn't find the episode. They searched for keywords: bathtub, drowning, insanity defense. Nothing matched. They discovered that while there was an episode about a woman who killed her children, the details were entirely different, and the insanity acquittal Dietz described simply never happened. Dr. Park Dietz, the most respected forensic psychiatrist in the country, had given false testimony in a death penalty case. This wasn't just a minor mistake. In the legal world, this was material perjury. The prosecution's theory of premeditation via television was built on a foundation of error. The false testimony had likely been the deciding factor for the jury, providing them with a reason to ignore the overwhelming evidence of Andrea's profound psychosis. The defense filed an appeal, arguing that Andrea's due process rights had been violated. For 2 years, the case moved through the appellate courts. The state of Texas fought back, arguing that even without the Law and Order testimony, there was enough evidence to convict her. But the taint of the lie was too strong. In 2005, the Texas First Court of Appeals made a landmark ruling. They vacated Andrea's conviction, stating that the false testimony had irreparably prejudiced the jury. The news sent a shockwave through the legal community. It meant that Andrea Yates would have to stand trial again. It meant that the families, the witnesses, and the city of Houston would have to relive the horror of June 20th all over again. But for the defense, it was a second chance to tell the story they felt had been drowned out by the prosecution's narrative. This time, they weren't going to let the trial be about a fictional TV show. They were going to pull back the curtain on the actual influences that had steered Andrea toward the bathtub, starting with the letters from a traveling preacher. As the 2006 retrial approached, the defense team realized they had to change their strategy. They couldn't just talk about chemical imbalances and hallucinations. They had to show the jury the mental environment Andrea was living in. They began to dig into the box of evidence they had largely overlooked in the first trial, a collection of cassette tapes and pamphlets from Michael Warnicki. They were about to discover that the preacher's influence was far deeper than they ever imagined, and that Andrea's delusion wasn't something she invented. It was something she was taught. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The 2006 retrial of Andrea Yates was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a cultural reckoning. For years had passed since the first jury found her guilty, and in that time, the landscape of American maternal health had shifted. The phantom episode of Law and Order was gone, and with it, the prosecution's strongest hook for premeditation. The defense team, now seasoned and deeply aware of the gaps in the first trial, prepared to move beyond the clinical definitions of the DSM-4. They realized that to win, they had to answer the why, not just the how. They had to show that Andrea's mind hadn't just broken, it had been colonized. The strategy for the 2006 trial centered on the concept of the delusional script. The defense argued that while postpartum psychosis provided the biological engine for the tragedy, the religious teachings of Michael Warnicki provided the roadmap. They introduced into evidence the Perilous Times pamphlets and the hours of cassette tapes that the Yates family had collected during their years on the road and in the bus. This was no longer just a medical case. It was an exposé on the power of spiritual isolation and high-control influence. The jury in 2006 was presented with a chilling portrait of Michael Warnicki's doctrine. Experts explained that his teachings were specifically designed to break down the individual's sense of self-worth. He preached that a mother was the primary spiritual gatekeeper for her children, and that if she were lukewarm or wicked, she was effectively a conduit for Satan. For a woman like Andrea, who was already experiencing the hallucination that she was the devil, these weren't just metaphors. They were literal instructions. One of the most devastating pieces of evidence was a series of letters from Rachel Warnicki. In them, the preacher's wife warned Andrea that her witch-like nature would doom her sons. The defense argued that when Andrea went to the bathtub on June 20th, she wasn't acting out of malice. She was performing what she believed was a sacrificial rescue. In her mind, She was taking the mark of the beast upon herself to ensure her children died in a state of innocence, thereby bypassing the hellfire the Warrenikis had promised her. The prosecution attempted to maintain their original stance, arguing that Andrea's decision to wait until Rusty left for work still proved she knew her actions were legally wrong. They portrayed her as a woman who sought a way out of a life she could no longer handle. But the weight of the psychiatric evidence was now bolstered by a better understanding of the medical community. In the years between trials, postpartum psychosis had become a widely discussed medical emergency rather than a taboo secret. On July 26, 2006, the jury returned with a verdict that changed the course of Texas legal history. Not guilty by reason of insanity. For the first time, a Texas jury had looked at the horrific drowning of 5 children and acknowledged that the person who committed the act was not a criminal, but a patient. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Rusty Yates, who had remained a complicated figure of support throughout the trials, sat in the gallery, his face a mask of exhaustion. Andrea, pale and heavily sedated, showed no outward sign of relief. To her, the verdict didn't bring her children back. It only confirmed the reality of the nightmare she had been living. Following the verdict, Andrea was not set free. Under Texas law, a person found NGRI, not guilty by reason of insanity, is committed to a high-security state mental health facility. She was initially sent to North Texas State Hospital and eventually moved to Kerrville State Hospital, a low-security facility nestled in the rolling hills of the Texas Hill Country. Life in Kerrville for Andrea Yates is a study in quiet, perpetual penance. Now in her early 60s, she is a model resident. Her daily routine is vastly different from the chaotic, high-pressure environment of the Beachcomber Lane house. She wakes early, attends therapy sessions, and participates in the hospital's vocational programs. She has become an expert at needlework and card making. She spends hours in the craft room, meticulously sewing aprons and creating intricate greeting cards. These items are sold anonymously at local craft fairs, with every penny of the proceeds being donated to the Yates Children Memorial Fund. It is her way of contributing to a world she once felt she had to leave. One of the most poignant aspects of her life today is her refusal to leave. Every year, hospital administrators and her legal counsel have the right to petition the court for her release. They evaluate her medication compliance, her mental stability, and her risk to the community. For over 18 years, the clinical consensus has often been that Andrea is no longer a danger to herself or others. She is sane now, thanks to consistent medical intervention and a controlled environment. Yet every year, when the paperwork is presented to her, Andrea Yates waives her right to a hearing. She refuses to ask for her freedom. Her lawyer, George Parnham, has stated that Andrea believes the hospital is where she belongs. She views her confinement not as a legal requirement, but as a spiritual necessity. To walk free into a world where she is famous for the worst hour of her life is a prospect she cannot face. More importantly, she believes that being locked away is the only penance that fits the magnitude of her loss. Her connection to the outside world is minimal. Rusty Yates eventually divorced Andrea and started a new family, a move that was met with mixed public reaction, but one that he claimed was necessary for his own survival. However, reports indicate that they remained in contact for years, occasionally speaking about the children they lost. Andrea keeps a small collection of photographs in her room, the only remnants of the lives of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. She watches videos of them playing, a haunting loop of what was before the fog of psychosis took over. The legacy of the Andrea Yates case extends far beyond the walls of Kerrville. It led to the Andrea Yates Bill in the Texas legislature, which sought to expand the insanity defense, though it faced significant opposition. It forced the medical community to implement mandatory screening for postpartum depression in new mothers. It turned a private tragedy into a public mission to ensure that no other woman is left in a 1-hour window with a mind poisoned by delusions. As the 25th anniversary of the tragedy approaches, Andrea Yates remains a ghost in the system. She is a woman who lives in the after, eternally tethered to a before she can never reclaim. She is the valedictorian who lost her way, the nurse who couldn't heal herself, and the mother who believed that death was the only form of protection she had left to give. In the quiet halls of the hospital, she is simply Andrea. She sews her aprons, she writes her cards, and she remembers 5 faces that the rest of the world only knows from crime scene photos. Her story remains a stark reminder that when we fail to protect the mental health of mothers, we fail to protect the lives of children. The silence in Kerrville is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a woman who has finally understood what happened in that bathtub, and who has decided that the only way to live with the memory is never to leave the place where she can't hurt anyone ever again. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, empathy, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button and comment your thoughts below. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.